What I'd like to do today in this presentation is simply to give you a sense of how deep, how layered and mysterious music really is. And I hope that this will change the way you perceive music. And when it comes to mysteries, the more we look, the deeper they get. You might be familiar with the short movie Powers of 10, which was produced by the EM's office in the 70s. In that movie, we take a journey through all the different levels and dimensions of space, going from the largest scale, seeing entire galaxies as just tiny specks of light, and then all the way till we reach Earth, and then zooming in further onto the hand of a person, and into a white blood cell, and still further into the smallest scales of space until we perceive just a single atom. And then it goes on into subatomic particles and all the way into the quantum soup. It's really a fascinating and stunning movie, and you can easily find it and watch it online if you haven't seen it before. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning it is that I'd like to start our exploration of music by taking you on a similar space travel through the different dimensions in a piece of music. We will take a large-scale construct, that is, a musical composition, and gradually zoom in through the various structures until we reach the very heart of a single note. We will pick Beethoven's famous Opus 53, his Piano Sonata No. 21 in C major, commonly referred to as the Waldstein Sonata. Here is a specific piece of music. Is that it? Simply a piece of enjoyable music which lasts roughly about 25 minutes? Or can we further zoom in? Well, of course we can. And the first obvious distinction we can make is that this work is not a continuous piece of uninterrupted music, but it is made up of three different parts, which we call movements. A first movement, the Allegro con brio. A second movement, which here serves as an introduction to the third movement. And the third movement, a rondo. And by the way, the fact that Beethoven turns the second movement into an introduction to the third movement is already a departure from the norm. But this might be material for another presentation. What we want to do now is to zoom into the first movement only. And as you might guess, when we look at the music of the first movement, we find out that it itself is also made up of distinguishable parts. It begins with what we call the exposition. Then we find a section that we call the development. Then there is a recapitulation, and then a coda, which is the final part that wraps up everything and closes the movement. So you could say three main parts plus a closing section. And now again, we want to zoom in even further and look at just one of these parts. We're going into the exposition. What does that look like? Again, the exposition also shows to have a certain structure, to be an arrangement made up of smaller parts. We can distinguish a section that introduces a first theme, then a part which is based around a second theme, and then again a sort of coda, in this case a kind of transition which, as you remember, would lead us into the next large part, the one that we didn't zoom into, the development. But we won't even go into the development now, because we just want to keep going further in each time into the very first parts that we find. So, as you might guess, we now want to take a closer look at this first section which introduces the first theme. And what will we find? Well, of course, we find the actual first theme itself of this musical movement. And what follows right away is a sort of repeat of the same theme, although in a varied way and with a different ending. And then we find a departure once again, a musical part which acts as a transition, or we could say a coda. Now, the role of this so-called coda is of course to lead us again into the part that we didn't look at. If you remember, that would be the section introducing the second theme of this sonata movement. But again, we're not looking at this now because we want, you might guess it by now, keep zooming in into the first part. So, let's go into the first theme itself. By the way, at this point, if you don't read music, do not worry. It's not necessary here. I just want you to follow the basic idea. So even if I may show you excerpts of scores every now and then, you do not need to be able to read the actual notes. What matters here is just that you follow the idea of smaller building blocks being arranged into larger units. So now, how is the first theme itself built? You might be well familiar with it. If you listen closely, you will detect that again you can distinguish parts. You will hear a first idea, the main subject of the theme itself. And then right away, you hear this same idea, the same subject again, although sounding slightly differently. It is different because Beethoven rewrites it one tone lower. But you can hear that it is basically the same statement. Then something else which leaves us hanging. This something else appears to be again a kind of miniature coda, a transition. Transition which allows Beethoven to lead us into the varied form of the first theme. But by now you start to get the idea that there is a sort of mirroring between the larger structures and the smaller ones. We keep finding these different parts and transitions as we go into one part, and when we zoom in we find a similar structure reflected again. Well, so by now you know what we'll do next. We're going to look at this first subject, the very first musical idea that Beethoven introduces. This in itself is a sort of organism, a kind of musical cell. And we can take our microscope now and look at this cell. What is it actually made of? If we take a look at the melodic outline, meaning we're looking at the notes that are on the very top, which is what we usually hear as the melody, we can see that we start on the note E. And again, don't worry here if you're not reading notes. I just want you to follow the basic idea. So our subject begins on the note E, repeated a bunch of times, and then climbs up to a G. The distance between these two notes, E and G, in music we call this a third. To be more precise, a minor third. This tiny musical idea, it's just a snippet of an idea, isn't it? We call it a motif. If we look a little further, we find the note B going back down to a G. And now B and G again form the distance of a third, although a slightly larger one, a major third. So we begin our subject going up some kind of a third and then going down some kind of a third. And right after, we encounter a different motif. This one starts on the note D and quickly descends stepwise all the way down to the note G. And this musical distance here is what we call a fifth. So, if we sum it up, we can say that in essence the main idea of Beethoven's first theme is an idea which is based on an outline of some thirds and an outline of a fifth. Thirds and fifths. It is, by the way, in itself not a particularly arresting or original idea. So was this just random? Well, Beethoven never randomly makes up anything. His ideas always seem to be deducted from something which was already there to begin with. So what is it that was already given to us before Beethoven introduces the melodic material for his main theme? The fact is, the first thing that we hear is not melodic at all. It is just a chord. A chord which we hear repeated 13 times in a row. And what is a chord? Well, it's simply a group of single notes played together at the same time. We have reached a musical molecule. And how is this molecule built? What is it made of? It's made of 4 single notes, all sounding at the same time. We have a C and a G played by the left hand, which is the musical distance of a fifth. And then a C again and an E played by the right hand, a musical distance of a third. A third and a fifth again, right there in this very first chord. Remember the same musical distances or intervals that Beethoven outlines in his main melodic idea. So we discover that the entire idea for Beethoven's theme was already contained and reflected within this very first chord, which we heard right in the beginning of the sonata. We still need to go further. Yes, indeed, we now have to ask, where did this chord come from? What is the basis for this particular molecule of notes? Did Beethoven also derive these 4 notes from something that was already here? Beethoven gives us a rather peculiar hint. Notice that the piece doesn't begin with the chord that I just talked about, this chord which already contains within itself the outline and the idea for the theme of the sonata. No, rather, it actually begins with a single note. The very first thing that we hear is a single low C. Could it be that this single low C also contains within itself some kind of blueprint for Beethoven's theme? This might at first sound completely crazy. How can a single note possibly contain anything? Isn't this where our space travel into music must end? Have we not reached the final and indivisible unit of music? Well, we might at this point well have reached what we could call a musical atom. But as we know, even in the case of atoms, we can go even further in and look at subatomic particles. And so, we shall do the same with this first note, as we'll zoom in even further. But for this, we first need to embark on an exploration into the nature of pitch. And this is exactly what we'll do in the next part of this presentation.